Judge Edward Chen stepped into court ready to embarrass Pam Bondi. But just moments later, the gavel came down on him. What followed left everyone in the courtroom speechless. The federal courthouse in downtown Miami buzzed with energy on that muggy Tuesday morning as journalists vied for space in the crowded gallery, their laptops balanced awkwardly on their knees and notepads open and waiting. Today's hearing drew national interest, not only because of the high-profile corruption case on the docket, but because Florida's ex-Attorney General Pam Bondi was set to go up against Judge Edward Chen, a man whose fierce reputation went before him. Judge Chen marched into the courtroom at exactly 9 a.m., his black robes flowing behind him like dark thunderclouds. At 58, he carried himself with the rigid stance of someone convinced his position made him untouchable. His wire-framed glasses rested on a sharp nose, and his thin lips looked permanently pressed into a scowl. "All rise!" the bailiff shouted, his voice bouncing through the suddenly quiet room as the hearing got underway. Pam Bondi, polished in a fitted navy suit, walked toward the podium. Before she could say anything, Judge Chen's voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Ms. Bondi, I see you're handling the defense today. I must admit, I'm surprised you chose to take on such a difficult case given your history." His tone made the words sound more like a jab. Bondi's face stayed composed, her blonde hair framing a look that gave away no reaction. "Good morning, Your Honor. Yes, I am lead counsel for the defense." Chen flipped through papers on his bench, not even glancing up. "Let's hope you're better prepared than in your last appearance in my courtroom. We wouldn't want a repeat of that embarrassing display." A wave of discomfort passed through the gallery. Everyone there recalled the last time Chen had frequently interrupted Bondi and rejected nearly all her motions. What they didn't know was that Bondi had spent the last 6 months getting ready for this moment. "I assure you, Your Honor, I am completely prepared," she said, her southern accent just a bit thicker, a small signal to those who knew her that she was controlling her anger. For the next 40 minutes, Judge Chen kept up his harsh approach, challenging Bondi's every statement with barely hidden contempt. He gave the prosecution wide freedom, while placing tight limits on Bondi's replies. Each time she began to gain traction, he found a way to cut her off or dismiss her arguments. In the gallery, veteran court reporters exchanged knowing looks. Chen's behavior had crossed from stern into clearly unprofessional. Several jurors shifted awkwardly in their chairs, noticing the uneven treatment. Through it all, Bondi stayed calm. While lesser attorneys might have buckled under Chen's nonstop pressure, she answered every insult with polite but strong responses. Those near her noticed her writing brief notes on a yellow legal pad, not the frantic scribbles of someone flustered, but steady, thoughtful records. As the morning session came to a close, Judge Chen looked over his glasses at Bondi. "We'll recess for lunch, Ms. Bondi. I suggest you use the break to rethink your approach. At this pace, your client might consider a plea." A few members of the prosecution grinned openly. Bondi calmly gathered her papers with slow, precise movements. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice firm enough to echo clearly across the courtroom. "I look forward to continuing after the recess." As Chen stood to leave, he didn't notice Bondi's co-counsel slide a thick manila envelope onto their table, a folder marked with federal labels that hadn't been there earlier. Nor did he see the tall, serious-faced woman who had quietly entered the back row during the hearing, her Department of Justice badge swinging from a lanyard. The storm was forming, but Judge Edward Chen, in his pride, couldn't recognize the warning signs. When court resumed after lunch, the atmosphere felt heavier, crackling with silent tension. Judge Chen returned to his bench with the same lofty posture, but now there was something almost dramatic in his scorn. The gallery had grown during the break, as word spread about the fiery morning session. "Ms. Bondi," Chen began coldly, "I've looked over some of your filings during the break. I must admit I'm having trouble understanding your legal logic. Perhaps you'd enlighten us with your unique reading of precedent." Some members of the prosecution laughed softly. One leaned over to whisper something to her colleague, who covered her mouth to hold back a chuckle. Bondi rose, adjusting her blazer. "I'd be happy to explain, Your Honor. The precedent set in Harrison v. Miller directly supports our claim." "Harrison v. Miller?" Chen cut in, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Really, Ms. Bondi? That case was effectively dismantled by the 11th Circuit just last year. I'd expect a former Attorney General to stay up to date on legal trends. But Chen's claim was wrong. The case he meant was Harris versus Millbrook, an entirely separate matter. The mix-up was obvious to any qualified lawyer in the room. Before Bondi could respond, Chen kept going with his public shaming. Perhaps in Florida, the bar for legal arguments is a bit more flexible, he said, triggering more barely hidden laughter. But in my courtroom, I expect counsel to arrive armed with more than charm and political ties. Several reporters typed rapidly on their laptops, documenting every word of the judge's inappropriate remarks. In the jury box, the jurors' faces ranged from uneasy to openly disapproving. Your Honor, Bondi replied calmly, if I may direct the court's attention to the supplementary brief we submitted. Page 17 outlines the difference between Harrison vs. Miller and the case you might be referencing. Chen waved a hand dismissively. Miss Bondi, I've been on this bench for 22 years. I don't need a reminder on case law from someone whose legal path has focused more on press events than on precedent. This time, the mockery crossed. A line so clear that even some of the prosecution's team looked uneasy. The Department of Justice observer in the back row was now jotting notes with heightened focus. Throughout the intense exchange, Bondi maintained a steady demeanor that stood in sharp contrast to Chen's growing, unprofessional behavior. She carefully documented each improper comment and procedural misstep, her legal pad now holding a detailed log of judicial abuse that would make any appellate court take serious notice. Your Honor, she said after a particularly harsh remark, may I request that my objection to the court's characterization be entered into the record? Note whatever you wish, Miss Bondi, Chen snapped. It won't change the weakness of your argument. Chen looked around the room, clearly playing to the crowd. In my view, when lawyers begin objecting to tone, it typically means they've run out of strong points. More smirks, more sideways glances, but something else was shifting in the air now. A quiet wave of sympathy toward Bondi and rising discomfort with Chen's conduct. During a quick sidebar with both attorneys, Chen leaned in toward Bondi, his voice low but still loud enough for those nearby. You're out of your league here, counselor. Always have been. Your name won't protect you in my courtroom. As they returned to their places, Bondi's co-counsel slid a new document across the table to her. She glanced at it quickly, then slipped it into her folio with a subtle nod. The slight motion went unnoticed by Chen, who was too caught up in his own act to realize that the courtroom's energy was beginning to shift. The court reporter's fingers raced across her stenotype, capturing not just the words, but the tone of a judge who had veered from stern into outright abusive. In the gallery, a sketch artist drew the moment that would soon flash across every major news broadcast. Judge Edward Chen, face curled in smug derision, towering over Pam Bondi, whose steady expression revealed none of the strategic counterpunch she was about to deliver. 3 hours into the afternoon, Chen's ridicule had become almost expected. Every time Bondi tried to lay out her defense, he found a fresh angle to undercut her. The routine had become so obvious that a heavy weariness had settled over the courtroom until Bondi finally stood to formally deliver her team's opening remarks. Your Honor, before I continue with our defense, I'd like to address some procedural matters that have arisen during today's hearing, she said, her voice gaining a new sharpness and resolve. Chen sighed dramatically. Miss Bondi, we've already wasted enough time on process complaints, unless there's something that actually matters. There is, Your Honor, she cut in, something she hadn't done until now. The quiet act of resistance sent a ripple of surprise through the room. I'd like to direct the court's attention to Judicial Canon 2A, which says a judge must follow the law and act in a way that upholds public trust in the judiciary's fairness and integrity. Chen's face tightened. Are you implying this court hasn't upheld judicial standards, counselor? I'm not just implying it, Your Honor, Bondi said. I'm formally entering into the record. The prosecution team exchanged tense looks. This was clearly new to them, too. And what exactly did this surveillance uncover regarding the current matter? Bondi asked. Rivera pulled a document from his folder. We have logs of 7 separate meetings between Judge Chen and Maxwell. Harrington, the CEO of Gulfstream Industries, the company that stands to benefit the most if the defendant is convicted. Bondi walked to the evidence cart and lifted a heavy binder. Your Honor, I'm submitting transcripts of recorded talks between you and Mr. Harrington, where you're quoted as saying you're focused on ensuring the right result in this trial. She handed copies to the clerk, the prosecution, and placed one on the bench before the judge. Chen's face turned from pale to ghostly as he stared at the transcript. In addition, Bondi went on, we have proof of large deposits made into an offshore account connected to Your Honor. Each deposit happening within 48 hours of major rulings that favored Gulfstream Industries or their branches. The lead prosecutor stood up abruptly. Your Honor, the government had no prior knowledge of these claims. We ask for an immediate sidebar. Chen seemed briefly frozen, his eyes glued to the financial files now being passed around the courtroom. Bank records, transfer slips, and shell company papers created a trail that led straight to his chambers. At the back, the Department of Justice observer had now been joined by 3 more agents, all with recognizable earpieces. They watched with measured focus, adding another layer of pressure to the already tense scene. Furthermore, Bondi said, her voice echoing through the stunned room, we have evidence showing Your Honor intentionally suppressed exculpatory evidence in 3 older cases, leading to wrongful convictions that financially aided Gulfstream Industries and its affiliates. She motioned to her co-counsel, who opened a laptop tied to the court's projector. Emails between Chen and various figures flashed on the screen, showing behavior that screamed of judicial abuse. These communications were obtained legally through federal warrants as part of a broader corruption probe, Bondi added, addressing not just the court, but the journalists scribbling notes and the jurors now staring at Judge Chen with disbelief. One older juror slowly shook her head, her look a mix of dismay and disgust. Chen finally managed to speak, but the strength in his voice was gone. This is outrageous. These charges are completely documented, confirmed, and backed by multiple sources, Bondi finished. And there's more, Your Honor. She nodded to Agent Rivera, who handed a sealed envelope to the court clerk. This includes an official request from the Department of Justice to immediately suspend these proceedings, pending a full investigation into judicial misconduct. As the clerk walked the envelope to Chen, the judge's hands were visibly trembling. The packed courtroom held its collective breath as the image of judicial integrity began to shatter before them. Judge Chen fumbled with the DOJ envelope, his fingers clumsy as he opened it. The room remained frozen. No one moved. Few even breathed as the judge scanned the page. His skin, once ghostly, now burned red with a deepening flush that crept from his collar. This is procedurally irregular, he stuttered, reaching for the gavel like it might ground him. These claims should have come through official channels, not ambushed in open court as some kind of publicity move. Pam Bondi stayed standing, her stance calm yet attentive. Your Honor, we tried to raise these issues through formal channels 3 separate times over the last 4 months. Each submission mysteriously vanished from the docket. After the 3rd attempt, we had no alternative but to bring our proof into open court where it could be officially recorded. She gestured toward the court reporter, whose fingers kept up their steady documentation of every exchange for the record. Copies of our prior submissions, along with delivery receipts, are part of Evidence Package B. The lead prosecutor, a seasoned litigator named James Moretti, stood up. Your Honor, in light of these grave accusations, the prosecution asks for a short recess to consult with the Department of Justice officials present in the room. Chen's gaze flicked toward the back of the chamber, where the number of instances of judicial misconduct directly affecting these proceedings was stacking up. Bondi's voice stayed composed, but a distinct firmness ran through her words. She signaled to her co-counsel, who came forward with a hefty binder. This provides a chronological summary of today's events, highlighted with the relevant judicial canons we believe have been breached. A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the most experienced reporters straightened up in their chairs. Additionally, Bondi continued, I'd like to highlight certain irregularities in Your Honor's management of this trial, in contrast with similar cases seen by this court. She began systematically outlining differences in Chen's decisions, cases where he had accepted the very same arguments she was now offering when they were delivered by other lawyers. With each instance, she listed case IDs, dates, and specific decisions, showing a trend that surpassed simple strictness and veered into outright bias. The color slowly drained from Chen's face as it dawned on him that Bondi had been keeping track of his actions, not just today, but over many months of groundwork. Her legal team had assembled a damning timeline of inconsistent rulings, hinting that his hostility toward Bondi was personal rather than procedural. "Miss Bondi," he said, trying to reassert authority, "this court won't tolerate groundless claims against—" "These aren't baseless, Your Honor," she interrupted, sliding another file toward the clerk. "This is a formal motion for your disqualification from this case due to proven bias. Under 28 U.S.C. Section 455, a judge must step aside from any proceeding where their fairness might reasonably be doubted." The Department of Justice observer had edged closer, now standing at the rear of the courtroom with a clear view of everything. A few jurors were watching Chen's expression with open curiosity. "Furthermore," Bondi continued without breaking, "Rhythm, we have reason to suspect that Your Honor's neutrality in this matter has been affected by elements outside this courtroom." She nodded toward her associate, who passed out sealed envelopes to the clerk, prosecution, and judicial assistant. These packets contained details of communications between Judge Chen and individuals with direct stakes in the verdict, messages that had not been disclosed, as required by law. For the first time that day, Judge Chen looked genuinely shaken. He reached for his water glass, but his hand was slightly unsteady. "This is highly unusual, Miss Bondi," he said, though his tone lacked its previous confidence. "Indeed it is, Your Honor," she responded. "Almost as unusual as a federal judge privately meeting with witnesses expected to testify for the prosecution." A wave of gasps moved through the room. The prosecutor stood, his face marked with confusion. "Your Honor, we're unaware of any such private meetings." The court reporter's hands paused above her keys for a beat, then resumed typing with fresh urgency. The clicking of her machine had become the loudest sound in a courtroom now collectively holding its breath. Chen's eyes flicked toward the exit, then back to Bondi, who stood calmly, awaiting his reply. The balance of power that had shaped the entire day had suddenly tilted, and everyone could feel it. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, Chen said abruptly, his voice tight. "Miss Bondi, I expect complete documentation of these grave accusations when we return." When Judge Chen re-entered following the break, the shift in him was evident. His previous swagger had disappeared, replaced by a rigid formality that convinced no one. The gallery had grown even more packed during the pause, as rumors spread that something remarkable was happening in courtroom 4B. "Miss Bondi, you may submit your proof regarding these claims," Chen said, trying to sound composed. Bondi stepped toward the bench, joined by her co-counsel, who pushed a small trolley carrying 3 sizable evidence boxes. "Thank you, Your Honor. With the court's approval, I'd like to call Special Agent Marcus Rivera from the FBI's Public Corruption Division to the stand." A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom as a man in a sharp, dark suit stood from the rear row and made his way forward. After being sworn in, Agent Rivera identified himself for the record. "Agent Rivera," Bondi began, "could you brief the court on Investigation 23JC789, specifically in connection to these proceedings?" Rivera nodded, his expression somber. "For the last 11 months, the FBI has been probing a pattern of judicial misconduct within this district. As part of that operation, we obtained authorized surveillance of communication between Judge Edward Chen and multiple individuals with financial stakes in cases before his court. The number of federal agents present had grown to 5. They didn't move toward him, but their presence alone was an unspoken warning. The machinery of justice, shifting its focus from the trial itself to the judge in charge. I will review these allegations," Chen said, his voice regaining some of its earlier command by sheer determination. "But I remind everyone here that allegations are not evidence, and I completely deny any hint of impropriety." Bondi tilted, her head slightly. "With all due respect, Your Honor, we're not just offering allegations. Agent Rivera, could you inform the court about the condition of the evidence introduced? Rivera cleared his throat. All material presented today has been validated by the FBI's forensic lab. The financial exchanges have been confirmed through subpoenaed bank statements from 3 nations. The audio recordings have been matched by voice analysis to include Judge Chen and the others named. Chen's legal instincts finally took over, self-preservation overriding his shock. This court will take a 30-minute recess. All materials will remain under the supervision of the court clerk. As he stood to retreat to his chambers, Bondi spoke again. Your Honor, considering the sensitivity of this evidence, we respectfully request that federal marshals safeguard it during the recess to ensure its security. The meaning was clear. She didn't trust Chen not to tamper with or erase the case against him. Reporters scribbled rapidly, capturing every detail of the escalating drama. Chen froze, then gave a rigid nod. So ordered. As he disappeared, through the chamber door, the courtroom erupted in low murmurs and whispered exchanges. Bondi's legal team clustered together, their faces serious, but with an undercurrent of quiet triumph. The prosecution had moved to a corner, speaking intensely, with 2 Department of Justice officials. Inside the jury box, several jurors were openly commenting on what they'd just seen, momentarily dropping all pretense of neutrality under the weight of such unexpected turns. One elderly juror caught Bondi's gaze and gave her a small nod of approval. Inside his chambers, Chen paced nervously, occasionally glancing at the phone like he was debating whether to use it. His judicial assistant knocked hesitantly. Judge Chen, there are 2 FBI agents here who would like to speak with you. Chen's shoulders dropped. Send them in. Meanwhile, out in the courthouse hallway, reporters were huddled around their phones, blasting out the story that was already shaking the legal world. Security had set up a perimeter, keeping at bay the swelling group of spectators and media who'd rushed in after catching wind of the initial reports. Bondi stood apart from the chaos, phone to her ear, listening carefully to someone on the other end. Her face gave away nothing, but those who knew her would have noticed the slight softening around her eyes, the subtle signal of a long-laid plan unfolding exactly on cue. When the 30-minute break stretched to 45 with no sign of Chen returning, a noticeable shift occurred in the room. The agents at the back subtly repositioned themselves near exits in the chamber door. The court clerk, who had just returned from a hushed chat in the hallway, looked visibly rattled. At precisely 52 minutes past the recess call, the bailiff stepped out from the judge's chambers. Instead of making the usual call to order, he approached the DOJ officials and entered a brief but intense conversation. One of the agents nodded, pulled out his phone, and stepped outside to make a call. Pam Bondi watched all of this unfold with the alertness of someone who had mapped every step. When her co-counsel leaned in to whisper, she gave the smallest shake of her head, a signal to wait. 5 minutes later, the back doors of the courtroom swung open. A woman in a sharp charcoal gray suit walked in, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. She moved directly to the front of the room, her badge identifying her as Deputy Director Lauren Vasquez from the DOJ's Public Integrity Section. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice cutting through the murmurs filling the room. I'm here to announce that Judge Edward Chen is currently being held pending official charges of judicial corruption, obstruction of justice, bribery, and racketeering under the RICO Act. The courtroom exploded with stunned outbursts. Several reporters dashed for the exits, eager to be the first to report the growing story. Furthermore, Vasquez continued once the noise had lessened, by directive of the Chief Judge of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, these proceedings are officially paused. The defendant's case will be reassigned to a new judge, and a comprehensive review of all rulings made by Judge Chen over the last 5 years will begin immediately. She turned to speak to the jury directly. You are all dismissed with the court's appreciation. You may be summoned again when this case resumes under different judicial oversight. As the jurors filed out, many gave glances of reluctant respect toward Bondi. Vasquez stepped toward the defense table. Ms. Bondi, I understand your team holds further evidence tied to our investigation. Bondi nodded. Yes, Director. We've gathered documentation on 17 cases that reveal a pattern of judicial misconduct. My office will give full cooperation. With your investigation, The lead prosecutor, Moretti, joined them, his expression serious. Director Vasquez, I want to state for the record that the prosecution had zero knowledge of Judge Chen's actions. We'll be launching our own internal audit to confirm the integrity of our cases. I understand, Mr. Moretti, Vasquez replied. For now, I recommend both legal teams get ready for a full restart of these proceedings, once a new judge is appointed. A stir at the door to the judge's chambers grabbed everyone's attention. 2 U.S. Marshals appeared, Judge Chen between them. The change was startling. The commanding presence who had ruled the courtroom just hours earlier now seemed diminished, almost fragile. His hands were restrained in front with silver handcuffs that gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights. Chen's eyes, blank with shock, briefly locked with Bondi's as he was led toward the side door used for prisoner transfers. In that brief silent moment, a recognition passed through him, the understanding that his downfall hadn't come from luck or chaos, but from the steady, methodical efforts of the woman he had once dismissed so casually. Bondi's expression stayed professional, revealing no emotion, but those closest to her might have caught the slight lift in her shoulders, not from pride, but as a quiet confirmation of the justice system she had served her whole career. As Chen vanished through the door, a court officer stepped up to Bondi with a form needing her signature, formal notice of the case's suspension. As she signed, camera flashes erupted from the gallery, freezing the moment that would fuel legal debate and headlines for months to come. The courthouse, long home to countless stories of justice and failure, had rarely seen such a dramatic shift in fortune in a single afternoon. And as Bondi collected her things, ready to face the media storm brewing outside, the gravity of what she had done settled around her. Not just a win in court, but the exposure of corruption that had infected the system she vowed to protect. Outside, the courthouse steps had morphed into a full-blown media circus. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes stretched skyward like mechanical pedals reaching for sunlight. Reporters jostled for space, microphones raised, camera crews maneuvering for the clearest shot of what everyone knew would become the day's most powerful image. They didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes after the proceedings were paused, the side entrance of the courthouse opened. 2 U.S. Marshals stepped out, flanking Judge Edward Chen. Under the unforgiving Florida sun, the handcuffs on his wrists caught the light, casting rainbow-like reflections over the white stone stairs. Chen's face was frozen in disbelief. The look of a man whose life had unraveled in a matter of hours. His usual polished appearance had fallen apart. His tie was crooked, and a thin film of sweat glistened on his brow despite the courthouse's air conditioning. The marshals guided him steadily toward a waiting black SUV, pushing through shouted questions and the unrelenting strobe of camera flashes. Judge Chen, do you have any comment on the corruption charges? Were you acting alone, or are others involved? Did you specifically target Pam Bondi? Was it personal? Chen kept his head down, offering no reaction to the barrage of questions. The same man who had started the morning by openly shaming a lawyer now lacked the strength to face the very public judgment he had brought upon himself. The marshals helped Chen into the vehicle.